Welcome back to another installment of my Castlevania retrospective series, where I've been exploring the evolution of the franchise while playing through every game and port in their entirety. The next batch of titles we're examining include further refinements on the groundwork laid by Symphony of the Night, with 2 sets of search-action trilogies on the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS, along with 2 ambitious and often under-discussed 3D titles sandwiched in between. And let's not forget a few juicy pieces of mobile phone Java jank mixed in for good measure. And one quick disclaimer before we get started. Since we're getting into more of the plot-heavy games of the series, I do want to mention there will be some mild spoilers ahead for some of these titles, but I will refrain from revealing some of the spicier plot twists whenever I can. Just a fair warning in case you haven't played some of these yet. First on our list, we have Circle of the Moon, released in 2001 as a launch title on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance handheld, and developed by KCE Kobe, the same team behind both of the Castlevania games on the N64. The story begins in an old Austrian castle in the year 1830, where preparations are underway for yet another resurrection of the Dark Lord Dracula. Vampire hunter Morris Baldwin and his apprentices Nathan Graves and Hugh Baldwin show up to handle it. But upon arrival, the castle's owner and Dracula's minion, Camilla, has already got the party started, and Dracula quickly blasts out the floor underneath Nathan and Hugh, delaying their fight until Drac can fully regain his strength at the imminent full moon. Hugh runs off to try and rescue his father, and you control Nathan from here, armed with the Hunter Whip. Circle of the Moon was developed to be somewhat of a standalone title in the series, hence the new cast of characters, but eventually was removed from canon by Koji Igarashi when he returned to Castlevania as producer after this game was finished. The gameplay builds upon the successful formula set forth in Symphony of the Night, that solidified the typical aspects of the Metroidvania or search-action genre, dropping you into a large castle to explore, where you must find new abilities to access new areas, all while developing your character through leveling up and gathering equipment and items dropped by enemies or scattered about the various zones of the castle. There's no item shop or currency here in this one, so it's on you to find anything you need. The game feel does retain some roots to the old classic Vanias, however, at least early in the game, with Nathan sporting a whip, along with the good old array of heart-powered sub-weapons. His movement is basic at first, but your techniques expand gradually as you find various relics, granting you plenty of maneuvers such as dashing, double jumping, slides, and wall jumps. So the further you get, the faster you can zip around the castle a bit more quickly. But the big new gimmick here is the DSS dual setup system, where collecting and equipping various combinations of magic cards grant you a variety of magical abilities that use up your MP. There are 2 sets of cards to collect, all randomly dropped by enemies, with action cards represented by Roman gods and attribute cards represented by various creatures. By equipping one of each for the first time, you can't always immediately figure out what they do without a bit of experimenting. And some of them are pretty obvious, such as imbuing your whip with an elemental augmentation. Some of them increase your stats, or some create a new elemental sword or other weapon type, or some summon creatures themselves. In some cases, they may also give you a new special move, but you'll have to figure out how to do it yourself, or look it up, of course. My personal favorite ability has to be turning into the skeleton, with a small chance of being able to throw a giant bone. So the card system is pretty interesting, but it does have its problems beyond the cryptic nature behind what some of the combinations do. The main problem being an abysmally low drop rate of 3% or less on some of them, even as low as 0.5% at worst, so it can be quite the grind to collect them all. If you're playing the more recently released Castlevania Advance Collection, which includes this and the other 2 GBA titles, there is at least a pop-up window you can turn on which shares some monster data regarding the cards, which can be a small help. Getting more into the structure of the game's layout, again, it's a similar setup to Symphony of the Night, with a big castle separated into various distinct zones connected to each other, and stocked full of various ghouls and ghosts, and bosses that often guard an important item, and sometimes moments of plot progression. This time around, there's no big twist like an inverted castle or anything, so exploring the castle is fairly straightforward, other than a few light puzzle-solving moments. The castle doesn't really have the rich detail and artistry of what we were spoiled with in Symphony of the Night, which is understandable given the hardware, but it does feel a bit drab and indistinct at times. There is an interesting battle arena, however, a challenging place to fight through a gauntlet of enemy encounters without the use of your magic cards. It's totally optional, but it's a pretty cool addition for anyone wanting a little difficulty boost or a decent spot for leveling up. And it's also home to 2 DSS cards that you can't get elsewhere. Speaking of difficulty, this one can get really brutal. First of all, healing items are in rather short supply, so you may need to take some extra time to farm drops from monsters to build up a stash of them. And some of the boss fights are pretty insane, like these 2 zombie dragons, or a very challenging Dracula fight at the end of the game. In my own first playthrough, it's likely I didn't have or simply didn't know the best card combo to battle these guys, so I definitely died a lot in the process of finishing this one. But if you can power through that, it's a very satisfying game to finish, although it's unfortunately lacking multiple endings and no additional playable characters. It does at least have a handful of unlockable modes, the Magician, Fighter, Shooter, and Thief modes, which start you out with various tweaks to your character, such as Magician starting you out with every single DSS card, Fighter disabling DSS cards entirely, and Shooter mode emphasizing sub-weapon use, and Thief mode reducing all of your stats except for luck, which is reminiscent of the secret luck mode from Symphony of the Night. These add some cool challenges if you want to replay the game, the only downside being you must unlock them in sequence, instead of just picking the one you want after beating the game once. So for me, this game was a little bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, I appreciated the difficulty boost compared to Symphony and never felt too overpowered, and Nathan's mobility feels pretty good once you gather up the various abilities. And the DSS system is pretty cool aside from the low drop rate and the issue of having to figure out what combinations actually do. On the other hand, Konami's first efforts on the GBA hold things back a bit, with a somewhat bland world to navigate and obvious downgrades in graphics and sound. Playing this on a real Game Boy Advance is actually really hard to see, especially on the launch model of the handheld with a pretty dim screen, so I'd highly suggest playing this on a proper TV or monitor if you can. In the end, it's definitely a solid title and an intriguing beginning for this handheld trilogy, but the lack of polish and brutal difficulty may be off-putting in comparison to what was to follow. The following year would see the release of Harmony of Dissonance in 2002, another Game Boy Advance title sticking with a similar search action formula, but with Igarashi returning to helm as producer and shifting development duties to KCE Tokyo. In fact, none of the Circle of the Moon devs were brought on for this one, and instead many Konami veterans were enlisted that had worked on Symphony of the Night and Contra Hard Corps. At this point, Igarashi would also continue to act as producer for the series until his departure from Konami in 2014. Harmony of Dissonance takes place 50 years after the events of Simon's Quest, with you in control of Just Belmont, and we actually have quite an emphasis on story and character development with one of the more dialogue-heavy entries in the series so far. The game opens up with Just's friend Maxim returning from a training expedition he went on after his disappointment of not inheriting the vampire killer whip, and he brings news of their childhood friend Lydia being kidnapped. Maxim leads him to a mysterious castle, and Just begins his mission, soon discovering that Maxim was possessed and had actually been trying to collect the various body parts of Dracula to resurrect him yet again. So we may be treading some familiar ground here, but we're at least not in an alternate timeline for this one, and as mentioned, there are plenty of little dialogue cutscenes to keep the story flowing. Also quite familiar is the gameplay formula, but with a little more polish than Circle of the Moon, and fortunately a lot more visible on the GBA screen this time. They may have overcorrected it a bit with some very bold sprite outlines on Just and on certain enemies, and some rather brash color choices in general. So it might look a little weird if you're playing on a TV or something these days, but it was certainly an improvement for those on the original handheld screens at the time. But getting more into the mechanics, it's mostly whip-centric combat again, but with a nice range of collectible upgrades. Your mobility also feels a little smoother and more versatile, with plenty of relics that add to your maneuvers along with a useful back and forward dash for dodging attacks. You've also got the classic sub-weapons, along with 5 different spell books that can be found and equipped. Each book combines with your specific sub-weapon in its own way, giving it a lot more oomph than they do on their own, and it opens up a wide range of attack potential. The books aren't random drops or anything either, so you won't have to worry so much about grinding for rare cards, and executing the new spells is very straightforward. Enemies do drop armor and other various items, and there's also currency and a merchant this time around, in case you need to stock up on anything, so that balances out the difficulty quite a bit. Leveling up your stats with experience points also sees a return here as well. The general character progression feels more in line with Symphony of the Night than Circle of the Moon did, but it's still a bit simpler and streamlined. And again, we've got a large castle to explore, split up into various zones, and with different enemies and bosses scattered about. Although this time around, you eventually gain the ability to switch between different dimensional layers, which have the same layout for the rooms, but with different monsters and items. It's not quite as interesting as the inverted castle was, and it can get a little tedious and confusing to remember if you've been somewhere or not, especially with how the map screen is set up. And it's arguably padding, but the game isn't overly long in the end anyway, so I won't complain about getting a bit more to do. I will say the level design is a bit weak though, with a lot of long corridors and not much fun platforming. It feels a bit lacking in secrets and hidden areas. But I definitely won't complain about collecting furniture. It may sound a little silly, but you can find a special room to call your own and fill it with random doodads and stuff that are hidden throughout the rest of the castle. It's entirely useless and optional, but I had some fun with it. Although some kind of stat bonuses or something for collecting them would have been a nice touch. Where Harmony lacks in level design, it does make up for it a bit with some pretty cool monsters and more interesting enemy behaviors in general. A lot of the sprites have been recycled from Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night, but plenty of wicked new ones are thrown into the mix, and overall there feels like more of an emphasis on combat challenges over platforming and exploration. Harmony also includes a handful of different endings, 2 bad ones and 1 best ending that follows the battle with Dracula, or at least a partially formed version of him anyway. There are a handful of extra modes unlocked after beating the game as well, including a mode where you can play as your possessed pal Maxim, a boss rush, a hard mode, and a no magic mode. And you can even play as Simon Belmont with a secret code as well. So it's a nice mix of post-game content. Overall, I did enjoy this one, but it still felt like there were some growing pains in developing this. Notably, the art and music here has taken a weird turn. Juiced Sprite looks especially messy, and obviously outlined for visibility to the point of distraction. And some other graphics almost seem distorted during pixel rescaling processes or something. And the soundtrack is pretty divisive as well. Lower quality of the GBA sound chip aside, the composer definitely went hard on the dissonance here. Which can be effective at times, but also sometimes a bit irritating. I did appreciate the kind of old-fashioned chiptune texture, however, and there are still some great themes in here. And I suppose it's interesting to hear something atypical of the usual Castlevania bangers. Difficulty-wise, I'd say this settles somewhere between the brutality of Circle of the Moon and the cakewalk nature of Symphony of the Night, so it feels pretty balanced. Yet it's just a downer how the castle and its 2 dimensions just aren't designed in a very compelling way most of the time. But it's still a very solid game and worthy of a playthrough, but probably not one I would want to revisit right away, especially considering how much the series would continue to improve. And rounding out the Game Boy Advance trilogy is Aria of Sorrow, released in 2003, again developed by the KCE Tokyo team. The story is set in 2035 this time, 36 years after Dracula had been sealed away into a solar eclipse by the Belmont clan. You play as teenage transfer student Soma Cruz, accidentally whisked away to Dracula's castle while visiting a shrine with his friend Mina, and soon encountering some monsters and a dude named Arikado, Alucard's not very convincing codename. And it's soon revealed that Soma has an innate ability to absorb monster souls and use their powers. And as you explore deeper and deeper, you'll encounter quite the cast of characters out to help or hinder your quest, including Yoko of the Belnades family, an ex-military guy turned merchant named Hammer, and Julius the badass Belmont, and Graham, who's looking to claim Dracula's powers for himself. And much like Harmony of Dissonance, this one has quite a bit of dialogue and plot development throughout the game. Gameplay-wise, Aria feels like Konami finally hit their stride with their formula here, without making any drastic changes at its core, but really polishing and cleaning up the weaker points of the first two GBA titles. So we're finally nearing the heights they hit with Symphony of the Night, despite still being on a lower tech handheld. Soma feels fairly similar to Alucard in the controls department, and the game offers up a similar wide variety of weapons and equipment to collect and use, so he's not stuck with a whip like Nathan and Juiced were, even to the point of being able to use a gun. But the biggest change here would have to be the removal of the typical sub-weapons and introducing the tactical soul system, focused around Soma's ability to absorb the souls of defeated enemies. As you kill monsters throughout the game, there's a random chance their soul will pop out and be automatically collected, granting Soma a new special technique or attribute that can be equipped and used at the cost of magic points. And with over 100 different enemies in the game, that opens up a massive array of abilities. There are 4 main soul types: ability souls that include the usual movement and navigation type things to progress to various areas in the castle, but the 3 you will be customizing to your liking are the bullet souls, which are usually some kind of attack, guardian souls, which are often defensive or summoning skills, or enchanted souls, which typically grant passive stat boosts or other abilities like water walking. This soul system, on top of the vast amount of gear to collect from monsters in the castle itself, gives you a constant stream of options in front of you, or at the very least, plenty of novelty. Now, depending on your preference, this wide openness could either be overwhelming or highly addictive. Just be ready for a real grind if you hope to collect every monster soul, with some of them having very low drop rates. Hammer at least sells a ring that can help you in this, if you've got the coin, of course. Or if you've got a friend that still plays this, you could even hook up a GBA link cable and trade souls with them. Gotta catch 'em all. The castle you're exploring is improved quite a bit from Harmony, ditching the two-dimensional planes thing, and you might notice an overall improvement in room design and more cohesive and detailed aesthetics. It also brings back more emphasis on hidden areas and breakable walls, to give you more incentive to explore, and it just feels a bit more engaging because of this. There's no gimmick introducing any kind of recycled areas here either, but still plenty of fun wandering to do as you fill in all those blue squares on the map. Fleshing out the experience further are multiple endings with some pretty juicy plot twists and a variety of modes to be unlocked, such as a hard mode, a new game plus option for keeping your items and souls, a boss rush mode, and a Julius mode, letting you play as the mysterious whip-cracking Belmont with a similar feel to Richter from Symphony of the Night. In my experience of playing all 3 of the GBA titles back-to-back during my Castlevania challenge, Aria really stuck the landing for me. The polish and refinement here is clear, the soul system was a lot of fun if you don't mind some grinding, and I gladly welcomed the return of Yamane on the soundtrack, and the difficulty felt just right. And what other game can you throw a hot plate of curry at the incarnation of chaos? I'll wait. Now, I don't want to downplay the other 2 GBA games too much here, they're really still worth a play as well, and may even just increase the impact of Aria like it did for me, as I really enjoy seeing a series improve and evolve. And I would also definitely recommend the Advanced Collection version of these games, a recent compilation of all three of them with some improvements in sound quality and other small quality of life updates for tracking items and soul drops, and some straightforward achievements. And it's really just nice to enjoy these on more modern screens and your controller of choice. And any physical collectors out there may want to take note of the Castlevania Double Pack on Game Boy Advance, which included both Harmony of Dissonance and Aria of Sorrow. And let's not forget one other way to play Aria, with the 2008 mobile phone port, released exclusively in Europe, and taking this rather substantial and deep game and heavily condensing it for the Java platform. And it's undeniably jank in comparison, but it's still rather ambitious for what it is, and a pretty fascinating playthrough if you're a big fan of the original. The graphics are certainly a bit crunchier, animations are choppier, and the music is way more MIDI-er. The castle layout is very condensed and simplified, but there's still the need to find the next boss and ability to progress. It still has soul collecting and character leveling and equipment to find. Now, it's certainly clunky to control this on a keypad, so the platforming and combat difficulty are compensated accordingly. But this can still be a solid 2 or 3 hours of a playthrough, and I honestly had more fun with this one than I expected. Now we'll veer away from the handheld Vanias and back to home consoles for a bit, and look at Castlevania's first return to a 3D space since the N64 games, and its first outing on the PlayStation 2 with Lament of Innocence, first released in 2003.
Sarah, wait for me. I'm coming to save you.
And notably also simply titled Castlevania in Japan, denoting an attempt at a fresh start for the series. And we're going way back to the start of the timeline for this one, to 1094 for the origin story of the Belmont clan, putting you in control of Leon Belmont. We're quickly treading some familiar ground yet again, with being on a mission to rescue your girlfriend from a vampire in a monster-filled castle. But there are actually quite a lot of surprising plot twists here, and the capabilities of the PS2 finally take the Castlevania series to a more cinematic potential, with Lament featuring the most cutscenes and spoken dialogue that we've seen yet in the series.
Who's there?
Now don't get so excited. I'm just an old man.
Again, I'll try to spoil as little as I can, since I think this game tends to be a bit forgotten and less played than some of the other games we're dipping into today. Maybe some folks watching out there might want to be surprised if they give this one a spin. Now, there are some valid reasons for Lament to be somewhat disregarded that I'll get into, but there's still a pretty cool story underneath here that rippled throughout the series canon, even to the point of officially removing the Game Boy title Castlevania Legends from the timeline, which had quite a different origin story of its own. So Lament of Innocence is basically a 3D Metroidvania, in contrast to the 2D titles for the Game Boy Advance being made in tandem, but also setting itself apart from the somewhat awkward N64 titles, especially regarding the controls. In what may have been likely influenced by the success of Capcom's Devil May Cry from 2001, Lament's combat went for a more fluid and combo-focused approach, with a variety of button combinations to chain strings of attacks together, and even having an on-screen hit counter. More and more attack combos and abilities are learned over time as you meet certain requirements, as opposed to having any kind of standard leveling or experience point system. Upgrades to your maximum health, hearts, and magic are dispersed about, and your whip can be upgraded, with various elemental bosses well hidden across the game, granting you an elemental augment that can be switched at will. And later in the game, you'll also unlock the true potential of the Vampire Killer Whip. Now that's also thanks to Ronaldo Gandolfini, an alchemist that has set up shop outside the castle and a major support to you in your quest. And he's actually the dude who gives you a whip in the first place. And of course, you can also jump around, which expands some of your combat and evasive maneuvers, but honestly, it doesn't feel great, especially during the game's infrequent but annoying platforming sections. Somehow it might actually feel worse to jump here than in Castlevania 64, and the uncontrollable camera perspective can be a problem as well, especially in the game's many hallways, where you may end up running towards the camera view and unable to see what's ahead of you. There are 5 returning sub-weapons that can be used, picked up at various set locations, and they can be combined with 7 different magical orbs that are gathered throughout your quest, giving each sub-weapon additional boosted abilities, much like the magic book system used in Harmony of Dissonance. And these do really add another nice layer of combat depth. I will mention there is a bit of a weird problem for switching orbs and also using items, where you have to navigate an on-screen menu in real time to do anything, usually while in the middle of fighting monsters. Even by the end of the game, I was losing fights while fumbling around in a menu instead of being able to just pause and do something. The game is structured slightly differently than previous search actionvanias that we've covered, setting you up in a main hub that includes Ronaldo's shop, which is good for stocking up on healing items and potential armor upgrades. And then there are 5 portals inside of the castle leading to different self-contained zones. There are some light puzzles to solve, but you won't really need to backtrack between zones that much. And once the boss in each zone has been defeated, you can proceed to one final zone. This hub setup places the game in some kind of gray area of open-ended but linear, and it definitely feels like combat was emphasized over exploration. Exploring is a little bit on the boring side, to be honest, with most of the maps consisting of various long hallways that connect large combat arena-like rooms, and there's not much variety in the atmosphere and aesthetics. Every once in a while there's a funky mini-game or something to mix things up, or one of those annoying platforming rooms, but those are few and far between. The gothic vibe we can expect is here, and it generally meets expectations, but the environments just felt a little bland after a while, just running through hallways to get to a big room full of enemies, rinse and repeat until you find the area's boss. I will say the bosses in this game are really cool, and some of them are quite difficult and exciting to conquer, with several old favorite ghouls and creeps making a return, and finishing each boss does help push the story forward with more lore dumps and plot twists abound, especially nearing the game's conclusion. There's also a very cool optional boss in the basement that's quite challenging, huge in scale, and gross as hell. My favorite combination. Now there aren't any multiple endings here unfortunately, but this was still a satisfying game to play through, and it was cool to learn more about the beginnings of the Belmonts. Beating the game does unlock a playable character who can be a lot of fun flying around and throwing magical swords all over the place, and beating it with him also unlocks a kinda goofy character named Pumpkin. Other extra modes include All Skill mode, which starts you out with every ability, or Crazy mode, which is essentially a cranked up hard mode. I think I already snuck in a few of my complaints while giving the overview of the game here. It's nothing overly horrible, of course, but enough little things piled up for me on this one to keep me from getting super engaged in my playthrough. But I did like how the story was presented, the music was fantastic, and the combat is pretty fluid and fun. But I mostly wish the castle layout hadn't felt so basic and repetitive, and streamlining out some of the RPG mechanics from the 2D titles was a net negative for me. But still, a very solid game that's worth a look, especially since it's not overly long, and for me, it served as a great primer for the next 3D title on our list.
I'll kill you and the knight!
Interesting.
So 2 years later, we would get Curse of Darkness, first released in 2005. Again for the PS2, but also on the original Xbox, and notably the first Castlevania game to be released on that console. The ports are nearly identical in content, but side by side you could argue the Xbox version looks a little bit nicer. Now this time we find ourselves in 1479, 3 years after the events of Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse, with you in control of Hector, the Forge Master, a former monster-making employee of Dracula who got tired of laying waste to humanity. But fellow Forge Master Isaac schemes to have Hector's wife burned at the stake, and Hector chases him to an abandoned castle to seek his revenge.
I will hunt you down like the beast you are!
The names Hector and Isaac may be familiar to anyone who has watched the Netflix animated series, which did pull some characters and ideas from Curse of Darkness, so it's neat to see their origins if you're a fan of that show. You'll also have some run-ins with Trevor Belmont, and some other folks like the kindly witch and shop owner Julia, the mysterious priest Zed, and time-traveling Saint Germain, all popping up in fully voiced cutscenes that move the game's plot along.
Who are you? Saint Germain. I won't bandy words with you. I have an urgent request.
While this was an attempt to further develop the events of Castlevania 3, beyond Trevor's presence, there aren't a lot of heavy references to that game otherwise. Sadly, no Alucard, Grant, or Sypha to be found. So again, we've got a 3D hack-and-slash combo-heavy thing happening here, not far removed from Lament of Innocence, but featuring quite a few more mechanics and things that I found really improved the overall experience and gave this more depth and polish. A big variety of weaponry makes a return, along with leveling up your character, which brings back the vibes from Symphony of the Night and Aria of Sorrow, as far as having a wide range of ways to lay waste to all the monsters in your journey. Each weapon type has its own variety of combos, and they do feel a little more deliberate this time. You might feel rewarded for a bit of precision as opposed to simply button mashing. There's also a crafting system introduced here, so with various resources you collect from monsters and locations, you combine resources with existing ones to create stronger weapons, or sometimes fun, silly things like a spiked baseball bat, or an electric guitar to thrash and shred your foes to death. You can also craft armor as well to continually boost your defensive capabilities, although that's more just about making numbers go up instead of anything of novelty. Beyond the wide range of equipment and crafting mechanics, familiars also make a grand return here, with a lot more depth and progression than what we got in Symphony of the Night. Referred to as innocent devils, you can gradually collect a handful of different monster buddies that will assist you in various ways, and are sometimes needed to simply be able to access new areas or open chests, but they also help you out in combat and support roles. They each have their own branching leveling path as well, and can be evolved to new forms. The different paths are determined by what weapon you're killing monsters with, so that is one thing you'll have to take note of while wandering around if you're trying for a specific evolution path. At the very least, it does force you to have a little more variety in what weapon you're using. And occasionally, they will lay an egg. This gives birth to a fresh monster of that same type, but with a higher overall potential, and an opportunity to test out evolving them in a different way. These innocent devils are generally a lot more useful and active than you might be expecting, and they can really help turn the tides during difficult fights, if you can manage their automated behaviors anyway. It's a surprisingly deep system, and I found it really fun to experiment with. Now for the layout of the game, the hub-style approach we saw in Lament is no more, and all of the different zones and numerous outdoor areas around the castle can connect to each other, along with various warp points in place. In fact, the majority of the game is outdoors and outside of Dracula's castle, so there's definitely more variety, and the long hallway to big room syndrome isn't as prevalent, but to be fair, there are still some kind of blandly designed spots here and there, and some drab brown and gray terrain typical of that era. Luckily, the camera is controllable though, so you won't have to run as blindly. That's also at the cost of the automatic lock-on system, which can lead to some very jerky and disorienting camera movements. As to be expected, you'll be hunting down plenty of bosses, with some great large-scale battles and stout challenges here and there, often punctuated with new story beats and plot twists. There aren't any multiple endings in this one, but once you finish the game, you do unlock Trevor as a playable character, armed with a vampire killer whip and classic sub-weapons. He does not level up, have any inventory, or innocent devils on his side, and instead needs to find items to increase his maximum health, hearts, attack, and defense. In the end, after my first time experiencing this game, I really had a good time with this one, and liked it considerably more than Lament of Innocence. The extra leveling, crafting, and familiar systems were a very fun addition, albeit slightly overwhelming when first encountering them and learning how they function. But it added some extra fun to wandering around and grinding mobs for progress. And some of the extra silly items and various chairs scattered around added some fun novelty as well. The challenge felt balanced, some tough but fair moments, and there's way less jank platforming to deal with. And another really top-notch soundtrack. Yamane just continues to knock it out of the park and expand her style here. So I was surprised, but this ended up easily the best 3D game in the series to this point in my book. So let's go back to the handheld realm again with Castlevania's first appearance on the Nintendo DS with Dawn of Sorrow, released in 2005. As a direct sequel to Aria of Sorrow, many team members from that GBA title would come on board again here, but also tasked with integrating some of the new tech introduced by the dual screens and touch control capabilities of the DS, for better or worse. The story takes place 1 year following the events of Aria of Sorrow, still with Soma Cruz at the forefront. While he thought his soul-absorbing powers had been lost after his last adventure, a cultist named Celia shows up to try and kill him to awaken Dracula's power and transfer that power over to one of her Dark Lord candidates. To be fair, it's an effort to bring balance to the world, as she believes there cannot be an ultimate good without an ultimate evil. But still, Soma embraces his special abilities once again and confronts the situation head-on, again with the support of Hammer, Yoko, Arikado, Julius, and Mina. The gameplay is very similar to Aria of Sorrow, with nearly identical controls and game feel, and with search action elements at its core, the same experience leveling mechanics, and tons of variety in weapons and equipment to find, and the return of the tactical soul system. There are a couple of slight tweaks in that regard, however. Souls can now be leveled up and improved slightly if you collect multiples of them. Yoko has also set up a little safe house where she can upgrade some of your weapons if you relinquish a specific soul to do so. Yet another incentive to grind for soul drops. These are both cool additions, I think, but if you're a completionist, you've got a lot of work ahead of you to find every soul and then max it out. Other additions involve the touchscreen, such as occasional rooms where you might have to whip out the stylus and break some blocks in your path, or being able to move some familiars around. More prevalent and more problematic, however, is the magic seal system, involving a special symbol which must be drawn by hand to finish off every boss fight. There are several seals that must be gathered up throughout the game, also acting kind of like keys to open up the doors to said boss rooms, and consisting of different line patterns gradually increasing in complexity. Once you get a boss down to 0 health, you'll need to quickly grab your stylus and correctly connect the dots in a pretty limited amount of time. Failing the seal will give the boss a bit of health back, and you'll have to drop him back to 0 and keep trying. And the boss fights are usually no joke in this game. And as you can imagine, they require both of your hands. So it can be pretty awkward to switch control schemes with such a tight time window, and it's quite frustrating to fail and have to continue refighting the boss. And honestly, when this game first came out, I found this gimmick to be so annoying that I gave up on the game and I didn't even bother with any DS games to follow it. Luckily these days, the re-release of the trilogy and the Dominus collection fixes that system a bit. The seals are still there, but each point in the seal has a corresponding button, so it ends up more like a QuickTime event. The complex seals are still a bit of a challenge to execute, but nowhere near as finicky as drawing them by hand. And if you're a sadist, you can still draw them with your controller's analog stick or a mouse if you wanted to. But otherwise, if you liked Aria of Sorrow, you'll really feel right at home. The cultist hideout is laid out pretty similarly to all the random castles we've played through, split up into zones and feeling pretty open-ended. There's at least a nice boost in graphical fidelity over the Game Boy Advance, with all of the backgrounds and sprites looking much cleaner, and some better sound quality for yet another banger of a soundtrack, and some very creative and impressive looking boss battles. There's plenty of dialogue again as well, although the tone feels a little sillier in some ways, not only in the character interactions, but with character portrait designs utilizing a more simple anime-style look to them. The story is still quite engaging though, and it does feature multiple endings again. And Julius mode also makes a return once you beat the game, but it's even better this time around, as you can also team up with Yoko and Arikado and switch between them at any time, giving a real Trevor Sypha Alucard Dracula's Curse vibe to a repeat playthrough. Now at the time, there were also some online capabilities, like trading souls over Wi-Fi, or a multiplayer versus mode where you could race each other through a customizable course. But these modes are sadly defunct now. Now overall, I really enjoyed this one, other than the magic seal stuff. And again, that's gladly no longer a problem with the Dominus collection. Aria of Sorrow really checked a lot of the right boxes as far as my gaming tastes go, so it's nice to see Dawn of Sorrow expanded upon these with better fidelity. Admittedly, it can also feel like more of the same. Anyways, this is still definitely worth a playthrough. My only regret is that when this version first came out, the stylus stuff caused me to ignore the 2 games to follow at the time. But as my more recent Castlevania challenge continued and I finally played through them, I discovered that I was definitely missing out. But before we get into those, it's time to dust off that old dumb phone again, as you can't forget another official Java port developed by GLU Mobile, released in 2008, with a handful of different variations depending on the capability of the phone hardware. Now, the plot and basic gameplay approach mirrored the DS game, but with everything greatly condensed, there are only 12 different souls that can be collected and used, and 4 different weapon types, 4 different armors, and 4 accessories. Yoko is still around though, and can do weapon upgrades, so that's pretty cool, but Hammer's shop is nowhere to be found. There aren't any one-time use items either, so healing happens right when you pick up some food or whenever you level up. Now, the castle map is very slimmed down, but still a fairly impressive effort on recreating the different zones. There are much fewer bosses, with their behaviors greatly simplified, which is probably for the best since the controls with a phone keypad are pretty rough, much like Aria of Sorrow's Java port. Some of the dialogue and character interactions are still there, and it does retain multiple endings as well, with some minor tweaks. And I was actually giddy to see the Cookie Monster show up in the bad ending. There's no Julius mode, sadly, but still I was pretty impressed with what was pulled off here, and while being pretty low in difficulty, I still had fun finishing this one over the course of a few hours, at least to see what adjustments were made to work within the stricter technical limitations. Next up, the DS-vania train continues with Portrait of Ruin, first released in 2006, further grinding out that Metroidvania concept with some more fresh things added and settling in more comfortably with the handheld hardware. Our story in this one picks up not long after the events of Castlevania Bloodlines, the Sega Genesis game, where you play as Jonathan Morris, son of vampire hunter John Morris. Also along for the journey is his friend Charlotte, a young sorceress and Belnade's descendant who has trained alongside him since they were young. A vampire artist named Bronner has brought the return of Dracula's castle, aided by the 2 vampire sisters Stella and Loretta, and it's of course up to Jonathan and Charlotte to put a stop to the chaos. And you guessed it, another resurrection of Dracula. Their support comes from Vincent, a priest who sets up a small shop for them to use, and Wind, a mysterious ghost acting as a mentor and also doles out various quests. And still at its foundation, we've got more search action here, and the controls aren't much different from usual, and there's a lot of equipment to collect and experience levels to gain. But this time, a big new mechanic revolves around the main duo, as you can rapidly switch between the 2 characters, with Jonathan's emphasis on weaponry, including the classic whip and a wide assortment of other weapons to find, along with sub-weapons that slowly increase in effectiveness with repeated use. Charlotte is more magic-centric, with her primary weapon being a spell book that shoots out various apparitions ranging from magical blades to Don Quixote. But she more importantly has a wide array of magical attacks and buffs. You can also even have both characters on the screen at once, with the secondary character following you around and also attacking anything nearby. and if they get hit by anything, your magic meter will be reduced. Sometimes you'll need both characters out to solve some basic puzzles or access an out-of-reach platform, or occasional action set-piece moments where you have to switch rapidly between them.
Charlotte! Jonathan! Charlotte!
You can also perform a variety of dual crush techniques, which use a ton of magic to unleash powerful attacks. Overall, the two characters provide really fun mechanics, and it really opens up a wide array of strategies to approach certain situations and boss fights, which are plentiful and usually awesome. Managing two characters and two sets of equipment can be a little overwhelming, especially in the first moments of the game, and each character has a lot of unique armor and weapons to pick from, but you'll probably quickly catch on to a playstyle that works for you. Oh, and one other big improvement, no more magic seals. In fact, you'll probably barely use the stylus at all in this particular playthrough, so that earned a few points from me. The game's layout also goes a bit beyond the main castle, as Bronner has also created a handful of paintings that act as portals to their own unique areas, giving level designers more creative freedom to produce more unusual environments to explore, like European villages or Egyptian pyramids. The main castle isn't super large, but there are 4 main portraits and 4 remixed versions of those portraits, along with another final portrait and 1 secret one, so there's plenty of ground to cover. It does lead to things feeling a little more linear than usual, with the areas being quite standalone, but at least this cuts down on the backtracking if you're not into that. Beyond exploring the castle to progress the main story, there are also quests given out by Wind with various rewards upon completion. They feel a little like MMO busy work at times, but they can help boost your characters a bit and give completionists even more stuff to do. There are also multiple endings like we've been used to by now, and another substantial set of extra post-game modes. Beyond the Boss Rush, Hard Mode, and New Game Plus, you also get Sisters Mode, where you can play as Stella and Loretta. Notably, you'll actually need to use the stylus to control them. But luckily, the controls are well designed so that you won't need 3 hands, and this actually refreshes the gameplay quite drastically. Richter Mode also makes a return here, but with Maria along for the ride as your switchable character. Now at this point in the challenge, I will admit my brain was turning into Castlevania soup, so this one was a lot to take in at first, but I really had a great time with it. Aesthetically, it feels really nicely polished, with possibly the best pixel art in the series so far, and the added variety of locales kept things really engaging. And yet again, another banger soundtrack, not only with great stuff from Yamane as usual, but Yuzo Koshiro joined in for a few tracks as well. There are tons of cool enemies, over 150 of them, and big gnarly bosses to encounter. The difficulty felt well balanced, with the duo system making me be much more thoughtful than purely reactive to survive whatever situation lied ahead. Just top-notch stuff. And somehow pushing the bar of quality even higher, we'll look at the third and final Nintendo DS entry, Order of Ecclesia, first released in 2008. It takes place in the 1800s following the events of Symphony of the Night, in a time where there are no Belmonts left, so different groups begin forming to stop the inevitable return of Dracula. Our main character, Shanoa, is part of one such group, which has harnessed the power of magical glyphs, including Dominus, consisting of 3 of them said to have the power to stop Dracula. The game begins with Shanoa being chosen as the vessel for Dominus, but her friend Albus interrupts the ritual and steals the glyphs, also managing to wipe Shanoa's memory and emotions in the process. The Order's leader, Barlow, sends her on a quest to get Dominus back, and our adventure begins. And again, we are in fairly familiar Metroidvania gameplay territory here, but with those glyphs being a central part of the tweaks made to that formula. Acting almost like a kind of hybrid of standard weapons and the soul system from the Sorrow games, Shanoa can absorb these glyphs found throughout the world to learn new abilities, gain new magical weapon attacks and spells, transform into other monsters, or get various stat boosts. Using any of these will deplete your magic meter, although it's worth mentioning this refills quite a bit faster than in previous games, almost feeling more like an endurance meter from other action RPG titles, where you must be more deliberate with your attacks. Glyphs are found in fixed spots or also recovered from enemies, sometimes when they die, or you may also need to interrupt their attacks if you happen to notice a glyph appear while you're in combat with them. Shinoa can equip 3 glyphs at one time, 1 for each hand and 1 for her back, so you can double fist weapons again, Symphony of the Night style, and can also chain attacks together into powerful combos. It takes a little getting used to get the weapon timing down, but it makes you feel pretty badass once you figure it out and makes the fighting pretty satisfying. You can also eventually perform glyph union techniques that combine the left and right-handed glyphs at the cost of hearts, sort of like a sub-weapon system that further expands your moveset. So deep down, the glyph system has a nice blend of familiarity, but presented in a new way, requiring some different strategies than what we've utilized in the past. The ability glyphs also have some fun ways to traverse around the world, like grapple gravity points that you can fling yourself around with, or the ability to crawl around within the walls. Another big change here is in the structure of the game, with a big world map acting as your main navigation hub that spreads out your journey across the landscape as opposed to one large interconnected map of rooms. It almost feels like a nod back to Simon's Quest, with the outdoor areas and other points of interest connecting to castles and dungeons, giving a bigger picture of the geography of the situation and a bigger scope for your adventure, with 20 varied locations to explore. Some of the areas are very linear and not substantial in length, but there are times where it can be worth backtracking to a previous spot to access a certain item or alternate exit with a newly found movement ability. There's also a main village you'll reach that's filled up with various NPCs that you rescue throughout your quest, and they'll usually set up some kind of shop or offer up little side quests to complete for various rewards, which are sometimes helpful items or maybe just collectible sound test things. But again, another reason to re-explore some previous areas. Most importantly, you can also find cats that take up residence here as well. Now this is what the DS stylus should be used for. There are bad and good endings yet again, and plenty of jaw-dropping plot twists to go around, but if you can rescue all of the missing villagers, you can proceed to Dracula's castle for the final showdown. Finishing the game also unlocks a hard mode, boss rush, and Albus mode for another playable character to mess around with. This also had an online versus mode, which sadly doesn't work anymore. And there is a little bonus granted if you link up your DS with your Wii. It gives you access to some extras on Castlevania Judgment, the wild and weird fighting game which we'll be covering in the next installment of these retrospectives. Now, it's a pretty close call, but I think this might just barely be the best of the DS trilogy for me, despite it underperforming in sales a bit. The aesthetics are at their peak here. It's got amazing pixel art, a great soundtrack, some very memorable and creative boss battles. I also really dug the Simon's Quest-like structure of the world, and the little side quests were fun and not too distracting. I also think it was probably the most challenging of the 3DS games, as I found I tend to appreciate something with teeth as I get deeper and deeper into this franchise. There are some annoying bits here and there, and some attacks have some really repetitive voice samples. Yes, Radiance, I get it.
Radiance! Radiance!
But overall, I think it's really a top-tier title in the franchise that you don't want to miss. And at this point, I really can't recommend the Dominus Collection enough, as a very convenient way to play these on your PC or home console, and adding some quality of life improvements, and even throwing in the old arcade game Haunted Castle and the awesome remake Haunted Castle Revisited as a nice surprise. And at this point, you might think we're done with handheld Vanias of that point in time, but oh no, we've got one more left, and it's not Dracula X Chronicles for PSP, as I already talked about that one in the last video. Now there's one more piece of Java-licious mobile jank to talk about here, with Order of Shadows, first released in 2007 in North America, and eventually a few years later in the UK. And it also got a Windows Phone release. And notably, we've got Victor and Tyrone Rodriguez in the development credits here, who would go on to form Nicalis, publisher of big indie games like the re-release of Cave Story and The Binding of Isaac. Oh boy, they've come a long way from this one. The flimsy premise here surrounds the spiky-haired Desmond Belmont, armed with a vampire killer whip, and trying to stop a Dracula resurrection sometime in the 1600s, with two sisters along for the ride to provide occasional bits of basic and derivative dialogue here and there. As you can imagine, this wasn't absorbed into the series canon at large, but at least attempts were made to integrate some kind of story at all. The gameplay is a very crude and scaled-down take on Symphony of the Night, with 2D platforming within a small game world. As is par for the course on a lot of old Java side-scrolling games like this, the controls are pretty rough as they had to cater to the mobile phone keypad. Most grievous here is the jumping. Up jumps, which, that's normal here, but to jump forward, you hold up, and letting go cuts your momentum. It's pretty unusual and unpleasant, and topped off with very laggy and choppy animation, not to mention highly questionable hitboxes for platforms and enemies. Now, to be fair, I'm kind of one of those sickos who likes the process of recalibrating my brain to adapt to this sort of jank. But even once you get used to it, it's still suffering, and actually considerably worse than the Java ports of Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow. There are at least some basic leveling up mechanics and sub-weapons to collect, sometimes even finding familiar swords like the Chrysogrim, although they drain a lot of magic power and are rarely more useful than your whip. Equally useless are the alchemy abilities, which are basically magic attacks like fireballs and whatnot. And again, you'll probably just want to stick to the whip most of the time, which does at least have a few permanent upgrades that can be found. Movement abilities include finding relics to allow you to slide and to double jump, each of which allow progress to a new area, letting this barely qualify as a Metroidvania. And of course, there are some enemies scattered around, lots of goofy-ass looking skeletons and bats, and a few bosses, and of course a Dracula showdown at the end. It's a pretty short and easy game that could be finished in an hour or so on your first attempt, but it does at least unlock a hard mode, which is considerably more annoying to finish since enemies just have more health, and they still give you the same ending. On a positive note, you can find tacos. Alright, I don't want to trash on this one too much more. It's pretty okay for what it is, and it'll definitely give you a few laughs if you're down with janky games. But I guess I had higher hopes for this one after how ambitious those other Java ports were. And that's the last game to cover in this retrospective episode for now, but brace yourself for some real oddballs in the next one. For the years following, it seemed like Konami really didn't know what to do with the franchise anymore, and things got real weird, to put it lightly. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.